Hi, I'm Liselle Sambury and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things writing, traditional publishing, and a little bit of reading. And this is the 2024 How I Make Money as a Full-Time Author video. I've done a series of these. I think I maybe have 3 other videos. I will link down in the description so you can check them out. And essentially what this video is I am chatting all about finances from the perspective of someone who is a full-time traditionally published author. I do not share exact facts and figures just for my own privacy's sake, but I do share percentages to kind of give you an idea of the sources of my income as an author, how it breaks down into things like taxes and retirement savings, all of that sort of thing, while also kind of discussing this year, once again, author expenses. And this year with my author expenses, I am sharing exact figures so you can kind of see like exact money wise what I'm kind of spending for my author business. And so that's really what this is kind of like a little bit of a way for me to share a little bit more about how I can manage to live as a full-time person, or like have being an author be my full-time job, and how that works out finances wise. Just for if you're curious, if you are considering writing full-time, if that's something you hope to do one day, either or, that's basically what this video is going to be about. I do have timestamps down below so you can kind of jump around to whatever you feel is relevant to you or watch the whole video through. But before we go ahead and get started, I do want to make some disclaimers. So the first is that I am not giving financial advice. I am not a financial expert. I'm not an accountant. I'm not an advisor. None of those things. I'm just kind of sharing with you my experience in the hopes that kind of gives you a little bit more information. But I am not providing financial advice. So just to get that out of there. And I also want to talk about the privileges involved in my life, because these sorts of things do have a significant impact on me being able to write full time. And I want to be transparent and upfront about those things, because if this is something you're considering, I want you to understand all the things that are kind of involved. So first and foremost, I live in Canada, and that means some things are different. So for example, I do have access to grants, which I don't think are so much of a thing in the US. So there are access for that. There's national grants, there's provincial grants, there's even grants for specific cities. And so that's something there. I also live in a place with a fairly low cost of living. And so my kind of mortgage rate isn't that high. And I split expenses with my partner. We do split them. This is not a case in which my partner could take over everything. But splitting them does make a difference in that I'm paying half instead of paying for everything. And then I do not have any dependents. I don't have any family that I look after. I don't have any children. I do have a dog, but that's pretty much it. And so I'm not doing that. And I also, well, I have some debt now. I didn't used to have so much debt. We did some home renovations, that sort of thing. But I don't have student debt, for example. And again, living in Canada, I have access to free universal health care. And on top of that, I am on my partner's health insurance. So for those extra things, I also have that sort of coverage. And so those are not costs that are kind of incorporated into my everyday life. And if something went wrong, I lost everything for some reason, I would have family who would help me along. Basically, you know, if I lost the house for some reason, they'd give me a place to stay. You know, I have a bit of a safety net in that case. So those are kind of all of the things that are involved. And with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the actual video. Starting off with my general income. So this is something that I've been able to have a couple years now to show you. And so what you're seeing here is a bar graph of the money I have earned since I started writing full time, which I started in 2021. And so this is kind of just a general bar graph of like how much I have made each year, gross. So what the business has made, you know, overall. And this year was the highest of them, which I do find kind of interesting. And I will talk about this a little bit more. But yeah, it is the highest of the years. You will often see a little bit of a trend, because when I first sign a new book contract, I get paid 50% upon signing usually. And so there's usually like a bigger chunk, and then in the years subsequent there's like a smaller chunk. And so I feel like there's a little bit of trend of that, like high up and then like down and then high up and then down. But yeah, just to kind of give you an idea of what I've made over the years, it's actually been like pretty similar and pretty steady, which I was surprised by this last year. I'm still surprised by it this year. I think because it was such a big leap to go into writing full time that I often kind of expect to have, I don't know, like some sort of like really bad year in between there, but I really haven't had that case. I've really just had years in which I've been better at managing those gross funds and which I've been worse at managing those gross funds. But that's just to give you an idea of kind of how the income is spread out over the years. And the next thing I want to talk about is incorporation. So this was the big new thing for me in 2024. So essentially I incorporated. So how to explain this? So if you're in the US, I think this is very similar to something like an S Corp. In Canada, maybe just in Ontario, but in Canada, as I understand it, this is called like a corporation. And so previously I was considered a sole proprietorship. And so my business was just kind of me as a person. And the incorporation, what that has done as it's separated me, the person, Liselle Sambury, from my corporation, the business of my writing. And that business includes not only my my writing stuff, but also actually includes YouTube, because it's an author-based, writing-based YouTube channel. And I mean, it's a lot of things, but the YouTube channel does also promote my books. So it's part of that author business section. And so essentially, this was something I had considered a while ago and didn't want to pull the plug on because it is very expensive to start up. The startup costs, which I will share with you later on when I talk about author expenses, the startup costs of the incorporation are significant. And I was constantly just kind of like, I just didn't want to pull the plug on it. And essentially why I ended up doing this is I just needed a way to distribute my income over a longer period of time. This is something that I thought me and my agency had worked something out, but it turns out that didn't work. So that's why I ended up going to this. But really the problem was, and the problem has been since my career started really, is that because I get the largest chunk of my my payment in 1 year, and then down the line I get much smaller payments, I was constantly in this position in which 1 year I would have too much money, and then the other years I would have too little money and I'd be panicking. And so what the corporation allows me to do is it allows me to put extra money that I do not need for that year into the corporation, where it is taxed at a lower rate, so that I can use that set aside money as income in future years. And so essentially it is just letting me set aside income so that I can have access to it in future years when I will have less active income coming in. And that is what was important to me in setting that up. And so the process of setting this up for me meant I hired a lawyer to do the incorporation. You can have accountants do the incorporation, but, and perhaps because my partner is a lawyer, he was like, you should have a lawyer do this. And so I had a lawyer do the incorporation, set up the business, all of that stuff. And then I have an accountant, and the accountant basically does monthly bookkeeping. I do some of it, and then I send it to them and they correct it. And they also do like a remittance to the government every month. And so that is how my corporation is being settled. And then I also have a financial advisor that helps me with many different things, but including investments, that sort of thing. And so essentially that was what I did this year. And so that has really changed up a lot of my finance things. And so I will kind of talk about that a little bit later, kind of how it's changed things. When I talk about the income stuff, it'll make it a little bit more clear, I think, to you. But that was something large that definitely changed how I went about my finances in 2024. And this was something that I like reached out to a bunch of authors too, to just kind of ask them, hey, are you incorporated? And like, what is your experience of this? And like, how has this gone for you? And it's one of those things where like, yeah, it was something where I felt that I needed to reach a certain stage of stability to feel comfortable doing, again, because of those startup costs and then also the monthly costs. It was just kind of like, I was a little bit afraid that I wouldn't have enough income to justify doing everything. But it ended up kind of just being a bit of a necessity. And so I went ahead and just kind of went forward with that in 2024. So that I just wanted to provide a little bit of context, a little bit more information about the whole incorporation process. Time to get into the charts. So this first chart that you're seeing on screen, this is my income sources for 2024. So this is kind of the different places where I got income from this year. And I am gonna look at my phone a little bit to read off the percentages because I could not make myself memorize these. So starting with advances, options, and foreign deals. So these account for 83% of my gross income. Which makes a lot of sense to me. That's usually the case. The advances do usually contribute much more to my income. And so I had the advances for A Mastery of Monsters, which is my new YA Dark Academia trilogy. And so it's a little bit interesting because in 2024, like I got the payment for the 2-book deal, and then we wanted to have that 3rd book. And so then we sold the 3rd book. And so even though they're kind of separated out, this does include the kind of like on-signing payment for both A Mastery of Monsters 1, 2, and 3. So the on-signing payment for 3 different books. So that is the advances in there. I also got paid for my film option. So Blood Like Magic was optioned by Circle Blue Entertainment. And so I was paid for that. So that was also included in that. And it's like a pretty like modest payment, I would say. I think sometimes when people hear the word film option, like movie option or whatever, they think that like, oh my gosh, this is like massive amount of money. That's not really the case for the film option. The option is usually something that's, unless you're like a huge book, the option is usually something that is more modest, which is in my case, but of course money is money and it's fantastic. And of course the potential of the book becoming like a show or a movie is amazing. So yeah, so that was in addition. I also did 3 foreign rights deals for various books. And I believe that was everything. Yes. So that's what's all fed into that 83%, but most of that is the advances coming from book deals. And then royalties we have at 12%. So the royalties that I received in 2024 are entirely from the Blood Like Magic duology. So that's Blood Like Magic and Blood Like Fate, which I still continue to be floored. Like my gosh, my first series is like the little engine that could. I really did not think I would be still receiving such significant royalties, like significant enough to be like more than 10% of my income, which to me is like a significant amount. And I really didn't expect to still be getting those. But yeah, it's just fantastic. And I've been really happy with that. And so far, the Blood Like duology are my only books that have earned out. But last time I got a royalty statement, or yeah, a royalty statement. Delicious Monsters, which is my third novel, was very close to earning out, and so I suspect that in the next, kind of the first statement I get in the beginning of 2025, or like mid 2025, probably be in March, I expect that that will maybe show some royalties. So that's really exciting about having multiple books earning royalties. Yeah, so that's really, really great. And that remains like a good chunk of my income. And then we have honorariums, which is 3%. So this includes like money I get almost always in Canada. I find that Canada tends to be the only place that I get honorariums for being on panels. So I was in a book festival, and I was in 2 panels, and so I was given an honorarium for being in both of those panels. But I would say the bulk of this figure is I did some peer reviewing with the Canada Council for the Arts. So this is basically like those grants that you apply for and that I have applied for. Those are kind of, the applications are read through by a council of peers, so by other authors, including myself, and we read through the applications and score them, and essentially are the ones kind of, you know, being like, okay, these are the ones we want to award the grant to. And so I was on a peer review council in 2024. And so I would say the bulk of this figure is actually that honorarium, because it's quite a bit more significant, because there's more work involved. There's a lot more application reading, that sort of thing. So versus like coming and sitting down and like being on a panel for an hour, which is like an hour's work. So I would say that's most of what that honorarium is. And then public lending right, so this is 1%, accounting for 1% of my gross income. So public lending right is something that is another Canadian thing. You may be starting to see why I said being Canadian was an important part of kind of talking about privileges as an author. But so the government essentially gives you money for people borrowing your book from the library. There is a cap, so it can't just kind of like go on forever. There's a certain cap on each title, and you can like max out the cap for each title. So I think you can get like there's like a certain maximum amount of money you can get, but it's still like, it can be quite significant, I would say, even though it's like 1% here. It's just because I made more money elsewhere, but I feel like it's pretty significant. And so, yeah, so you apply for that every year. So if you are like an author publishing, and your books are in Canadian libraries, I would definitely go ahead and like look up public lending right, because you do have to apply in order to kind of have this going. And by apply, I mean, you basically just send out information about your titles, and then they put that in the system, and that's how you get the money and the payment and all of that stuff. They don't just do that automatically for you, so you do need to opt into that, which I really like, and it's great. I always like to encourage people to get my books from the library anyway, but this is kind of really nice because in Canada you kind of, you know, pushing people to get your books from the library, there is like I guess like an additional incentive in that way, even though it's not like a huge amount of money, it's still like significant. Again, I say money is money, and it's always helpful. And then lastly, 1% of my income is accounted by YouTube and affiliates. You'll notice I've now added. So this is YouTube AdSense, essentially. I don't do sponsorships. At first, the thing about sponsorships was that I was never offered a sponsorship, and then one came through, and then I was just like, this is too much work for me, and I don't want to do this. So then I was just like, I just don't do sponsorships now at this point. So yeah, so that's the thing about YouTube. So it's just AdSense, but then there's also affiliates. So I became a Plotter affiliate. Plotter is a plotting software that I talk a lot about because it is the software that I use for plotting. And I was creating videos talking about Plotter, and Plotter saw it and they were like, hey, do you want to be part of our affiliate program? And I was like, sure. So essentially that means if people click through my link and you purchase a subscription to Plotter, I get a small portion of that. It does not at all affect how I talk about Plotter on the channel. I'm always honest about it. I say whatever. And so that's like a side thing. It's not like a thing in which they have sponsored me and I like have to be positive about it or anything like that. It's just kind of like an affiliate link, like Amazon affiliate links, that sort of thing. And so yeah, and so thank you to everyone who has clicked my links, because I have gotten funds from that affiliate. And so that's basically what that section is. And those are all of the things that contribute to the sources of my income. Now we're going to do a 2024 to 2023 comparison. So on the screen, you're seeing two graphs now. And so one is from 2023 and one is from 2024. The 2023 should be on the left. I would have probably labeled them at this point. But anyway, so one from 2023, one from 2024. The big difference I think you'll see between them is that in 2023, I received a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts. And in 2024, I did not, because I did not apply. Because yeah, I was in a position where I felt like my income was stable. And so I didn't need to have the grant to add on to my income to help me kind of reach something livable. I was good, I had enough, and so I didn't need to apply for a grant. So that is what happened there. And so that chunk is missing from the 2024. And in 2023, you'll also notice the advances accounted for like a smaller percentage. This is because I gotten a smaller payment of advance in that year, because I was just receiving my kind of last payment for that Delicious Monsters Tender Beast deal. And so that's why it's kind of less of a chunk represented there. And the public lending rate, I will say it shows as 1% for both of these, but I actually got, I want to say like 4 times the amount in 2024 than I got in 2023, because I had more titles out for longer. And so it was larger, but it was just kind of the way that the percentages are, I think just because it's like fairly negligible in terms of like the entirety of my gross income, it shows them both as 1%. But in 2024, I did get much more from public lending rate than I did in 2023. And then also, I guess they seem kind of similar, but in 2024, I did also get less royalties, even though the royalties are significant. And I would say that's probably due to the fact that both Blood Like Magic and Blood Like Fate are in paperback now. And paperbacks are, well, they cost less, so that's it. So my percentage would be less, but also you get less, or I get a lower percentage of royalties on paperbacks than I do on hardcovers. And so I feel like that makes sense as to why it would become lower in 2024. And those are really, I would say, like the kind of big differences. Now let's go into the income breakdown. So if you're looking at this chart, especially if you've watched my previous videos in this series, it's gonna look a little funky, but I am gonna explain it. And the reason this looks so different is because of the incorporation. And so yeah, I'll be able to talk about those a little bit more as I go through. But starting with, so taxes accounted for 20% of my gross income. Essentially, I fucked up here. So I will get more into that when I talk about financial learnings later, but essentially I screwed something up. But anyway, I messed something up, but this reflects the actual amount that I paid for taxes in 2024. So previously I've been like, this is kind of more of a prediction because I don't really know. Turns out I did know the whole, anyway, I will get into it. But so this reflects the actual amount that I paid for taxes in 2024, but this includes 2 years of paying for taxes. So this includes both 2024 and 2025. Again, more on that later, but that is what this tax chunk is basically assessing for. It is for 2 years of taxes, not just one. And so my 2024 salary, so this accounts for 22% of my gross income in 2024. So this is kind of the big thing that was different in 2024. So because I am a corporation, I'm essentially deciding what my salary will be for the year. And it's basically whatever I dole out to myself, and whatever is kept in the corporation is part of, I guess, like the corporate, I don't know, the gross corporate amount. This is why I say I'm not a financial expert. but essentially I choose what is going to be my salary for the year. And so in 2024, that's what I decided was my salary, for a variety of reasons, but partially because I want to live in a new house. And so I was trying to do a bit of like, I don't know, I guess like a little bit of saving, but also a little bit of like being cautious in case we like I need a higher salary later to cover costs of a new house, which I assume would be more expensive because I would like more space. And so it was kind of like, yeah, a bit of like cautiousness just generally. And so that's how that ended up working out. And so, yeah, that is how I did my salary for that. And then my 2025 salary accounts for 36% of the gross income that I received in 2024. And so this is basically what I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to pay myself in 2025. And so this is what I meant really about the corporation and like being able to carry over income to different years. So in 2024, I don't need all of the money that I've received, but I will need a chunk of that money in 2025 to cover my living expenses and all of that for 2025. And I did increase this partially because then I later realized in the latter half of 2024 that I wasn't giving myself enough money. I was being overly cautious and it was just causing issues, and that I like didn't have enough to live. And then I started paying myself a little bit more. And so I've adjusted that for 2025. Along with like giving myself a little bit more room, again, in case of the buying of a new house, in which case it would probably be more expensive again because I want more room. And so I set kind of like a higher amount aside for 2025 with that goal in mind of new house. So that is why it is a larger chunk than the 2024 chunk. And so this is money, I guess, kind of like set aside. Now that we're in 2025, I'm already using it. But yes, so that is kind of how that's working out. I hope that you are able to coherently follow this. I feel like it's a little bit wonky, a little bit complicated, but hopefully it makes sense as I'm explaining it. So that's that. And I will say the 2025 salary also included some interest because of the investments that my financial advisor made. There was a little bit extra in that was coming through investments that I was able to add on to that salary. That sort of thing. And so corporate funds, this accounts for 17% of my income. So basically, this is money that is set aside for the future. So essentially, I guess I could have really named this part of 2026 income, but it's not the whole. So it's basically like what's in there is not enough to make up a full year salary, which you could see based on the kind of percentages of the other salaries. Like it should be like kind of 36%. And this is because I know that in 2025, this year, I'm going to be paid a portion of my advance, and that will essentially go into that corporate fund section for 2026. So I hope that this is kind of making sense. So essentially, of everything that I have made in 2024, because I know that's when I'm going to make my most money, I have been setting aside chunks of money in order to create that livable income for future years. And so that's essentially what is happening there. And so what is in that corporate account will be taxed at a corporate rate, which again is lower than kind of the personal tax rate. And so that's the benefit of having the corporation, because if I had kept all of that money in my personal whatever, then I would have been taxed way more, which has happened in the past, in which I've been taxed so much that I do not have enough to sustain me for the next year, which is often in which case when I've like panicked and like applied for a grant because I'm like, I need extra support because I can't live on that. And so that is basically what is happening here. And so it's essentially like what I have been paid, which I have been paid a portion for like 3 books that are coming out in 3 years. I've essentially just spread that out for 3 years. And so this is kind of the solution to that. So you'll see like authors will talk about like payments being spread out throughout years, and that kind of makes things difficult as an author to kind of like, it requires more planning of your income, especially in my case, in which this is my only income. And so that's what this whole thing has been done basically, to help me with that. So that is the entirety of that situation. It is a little bit complicated, but I think it's more complicated because it's a corporation, and it's just more complicated as a business than being a sole proprietorship. So that's that. And then second to lastly, so corporate spend, which is 5%. So this is basically times in which I had to use some of that money that I had set aside that, well, basically all of my income now goes into the corporation first. And from there, things can be doled out. So just to clear that up. But the corporation can pay for things within the corporation, which is separate from me paying for things from my personal income. I usually try and pay for everything from my personal income because I don't want to touch the set aside money, because it is set aside to be my income for future years. But because I paid myself too little in 2024, there were situations in which I needed to purchase something for the business and I didn't have enough in my personal account. So then I used money from the corporation to pay for that business expense instead of sending over money from my personal account to the business account. Again, I hope that is not too complicated. But yeah, so essentially you can think of it like this. I had put money in like savings, where the savings is the corporation. And I had a situation in which I had to use my savings, instead of just using what I had, because what I had wasn't enough. And this was like poor planning on my part, which is why in 2025, I increased that income. Part of the reason why I increased that income, because it became clear to me that I was not giving myself enough to live on, given my expenses and needs and that sort of thing. So that is basically the long and short of that whole thing. And then finally, I want to talk about something that is not on here. And so that is retirement. So this is a little bit complicated. I used to just throw a bunch into like a separate retirement account, quite honestly, because I was panicked and I didn't know what I was doing. Whereas now I will be relying on my financial advisor to tell me when it is good for me to put money in there and when I should just kind of leave it in a different sort of investment account. And so that's why it's not on here, because I just don't know what that's going to be. And my financial advisor will tell me at a later date what is kind of best to do for that. And so that's why it's not there. But I will say that in Canada, what part of what you are taxed for, like part of that tax section, part of that will be put away for retirement automatically. And so they kind of do that for you. And so what I was doing in the past is I was adding more. I was doing additional retirement contributions on top of what would have already been pulled out from tax. And so, yeah, that is basically why it is not on here anymore. And so finally, I am not going to be doing a 2023-2024 comparison because the 2024 situation is just so wildly different from how 2023 was. It's not even like a helpful comparison because things are just so different because of the incorporation. But this is essentially how the income breakdown is for that 2024 year. I know it's a little confusing, but it perhaps makes more sense if you think about the next year's kind of salaries and corporate funds as savings. And corporate spend you think of as like savings I had to spend for emergency situations, or not really emergency, just like expenses that came up that I didn't expect. And then you think of 2024 salary as like what I actually spent in 2024 and everything else being set aside. So yeah, I hope that will help clarify all of that. And if you have any questions, you can kind of let me know and I can clarify further. Again, not a financial expert, so I'm not giving financial advice, but if you want to understand my situation a little bit more, you can go ahead and ask questions about that. Now we're going to talk about author expenses. So these are basically this different things that I spend money on for my business as an author. This does not include everything that I kind of write off on my taxes. There's a lot of different things that go into that, and it's like complicated, and there's stuff with like spouses and all that stuff. But this is just kind of like, I pulled out basically things that are like very author writer specific, that I figured you'd have interest in kind of knowing the costs around those different things and like what I spend on that. And so in this one, that's what this encompasses. And I'm gonna be brave and share exact figures. I thought that last year I had shared exact figures, and then when I went back to look at my notes, I realized that I in fact had chickened out and not shared exact figures and had just shared percentages. And I think it's like, for me, like the whole of my income, like that being private, like that makes a lot of sense. But in this case, I was like, I don't really see anything wrong with kind of sharing figures, and I want to disclaimer this, and I want to make this very, very clear. You do not have to spend the amount of money that I am spending on things. There are lots of authors who I'm sure spend less, spend more. It is basically kind of very dependent. And so this is kind of what I choose to invest in my business, how I choose to live. In previous years in which my income was lower, I was not spending this amount. And so I just want to make that very clear, so that you do not come away from this thinking, oh no, is this how much I should be spending on X? It is not. There is no like, this is not the end all be all of what you should spend on things. This is just what I personally have chosen to spend on things for me as an author and my author business. So just want to make that clear before we jump into things. Starting off with books. So in 2024, I spent $2,335.74 on books, which is 12% of this little pie that you see. And yeah, I spent a lot of money on books. It's important to me. I also read a lot of books. So in 2024, I read something like 80 books. And so kind of resultingly, I do tend to purchase a lot of books. In 2024, I also made it a priority to purchase more from independent bookstores. And so the thing about independent bookstores is that they usually are not doing like these big like 20, 30, whatever % off sales. And so often I was buying books full price in Canada, which in Canada, books tend to be quite a bit more expensive than they are in the States. So in Canada, like a young adult book, at this point is usually about $25 to $28, and an adult book can be anywhere from like $35 to $40. So these are like the full price costs of books in Canada. If you've ever purchased a book in the US and you flip and you can see the little cost of US and Canada, you can see the disparity of that. And so books tend to be more expensive. And so that's kind of the way that is. This also includes subscriptions to things like Libra FM and Everand. So I chose to subscribe to Libra FM instead of something like Audible. And so I do that instead because it supports, again, indie bookstores. And so I have a subscription to that, that I do kind of like on and off depending on availability of books. And then Everand, I do a yearly subscription. And so I just set that for a year. And yeah, so there's that. I also realized belatedly that I didn't include Spotify in this, but I should have, because I do pay for Spotify, and Spotify now, like the way it is they have audiobooks, but I think they didn't get that until like a significant portion into 2024. So it's not that bad. But that's the books section. And then advertising and promotion. So in 2024, I spent $2,958.83 on advertising and promotion, which accounts for 16% of that little pie chart. So the biggest chunk of this, I would say, is probably the Tender Beasts pre-order / library request campaign that I did. I would say that's kind of like the biggest chunk of this, because even though like I was doing it for like yeah, I purchased all of the stuff for it basically at the beginning of 2024 because it was coming out at the end of February. And so there were bookmarks, there were art prints, there were patches. I don't know if I did the patches, if I paid for them in 2023 or 2024. I can't remember right now. But anyway, there were a lot of products, and also this is also including, or is this including mailing? Yes, I think this is included mailing. Yes, the postage. The postage is included in this. And so it also includes the mailing costs, which do tend to be higher in Canada. And also my P.O. box. The P.O. box is like a pretty good chunk of money. And I pay for that so that I can have a return address that is not my personal home address for safety's sake. And so P.O. box, any other postage that I paid for. I also did a number of art commissions. So these were basically for the promotion of A Mastery of Monsters. In 2024, I purchased some art commissions, or commissioned some art in order to have stuff to print in 2025, which I will print at some point in 2025 for the promotion of A Mastery of Monsters. And this also includes props. So I will purchase like props to do those photos. So those like pretty flat lay photos that you see me doing on Instagram. I have bought like props for those sorts of things. I usually try and like get a lot of stuff actually from the dollar store, and I went to the thrift store and I got a lot of stuff from there too. But like sometimes there are things like, I use a lot of blankets, and so I'll like go to HomeSense and I get blankets. I also get a lot of decor things from HomeSense. Anyway, so that's basically kind of the advertising and promotion section. Some people will say for authors to set aside a portion of your advance specifically to use for advertising and promotion. I have never done this. And the reason I've never done this is because I have always kind of been sort of panicked about whether or not I will need those funds to live, and therefore can't like justify setting those aside. And so I just kind of like I do this a little bit on the fly. So the spending is a little bit more on the fly, just because I never really feel like I can just be setting aside random chunks of money potentially for advertising and promotion. And so I work it into my salary, and then I decide based on kind of like the money that I have, how I'm going to spend on advertising and promotion. I'm not always great at this, hence why I had that corporate spend. But I try my best to do it like that. So I don't really set aside these chunks, especially because this is my full-time income. But even when I had a day job, I didn't set aside any chunks because I was like, I need this to pay off my student loan. So yeah. Anyway, moving on from that. So computer software and subscriptions. So in 2024, I spent $1,579.83 on this, which counts for 88% of that pie. So these are things like my Notion upgrade. So I upgraded to the paid version of Notion just because I'm using it so much for all of my different stuff. Also, I wanted access to the charts, and you have to do the paid subscription to have access to the charts, is a whole thing. So, so I did a paid Notion subscription. I also switched to a Plotter lifetime subscription in 2024, just before they did their price hike. So I was very happy about that because all of a sudden their prices are way higher. So, which, you know, you adjust prices, you're a business, you're a company, I get it, you adjust prices for different things. It's just, it used to be incredibly affordable, like I would say bordering on cheap, and now it's quite a bit more pricey. So I got in there for my lifetime subscription just before that happened, which was great. So I have a lifetime subscription to Plotter just because I use it so much. I can't conceive of a situation in which I would not be using it. And so instead of just like paying yearly, I decided, let me just pull the plug and just pull the plug. I don't know what the phrase is, but anyway, I decided, let me just get the lifetime version. And so I went and I did that. This also includes my website hosting, which keeps hiking up for reasons. They're very annoying about it. But yeah, this also includes my website hosting, anything I need for the website, if I have to like get new plugins or paid plugins or anything like that. I do have a theme that I also have a lifetime subscription on, so I don't usually, I run it on WordPress. I don't usually change the theme. It's kind of been the same theme because it's a very robust sort of system. And so I paid for that lifetime ages ago. And so I keep using that. And then just kind of whatever subscriptions, like Microsoft Word, my Microsoft Word subscription, things like that that are specific to computer software. So there's that. And I will say I use Adobe Suite, and my mom has Adobe Suite for her own business, and I piggyback on it because I'm that sort of child. So yeah, I don't pay for that. And then incorporation costs. So the incorporation costs were $3,854.63, which accounts for 21% of this pie. So this is what I mean when I said the setup costs for incorporation are expensive. They are expensive. And so yeah, this included, so the lawyer's fee for setting everything up. I will say again that because my partner is a lawyer, I used his old firm that he used to work for. I used them to do that, and we're friendly with them, but we have a good relationship. And so there are certain things, like I was probably given a discounted rate. There was also something, I can't remember what it was, but they like waived it for me. And so this is what I mean by saying, like, yeah, so even though incorporation is expensive, I was also given a bit of a deal there. I do feel really good about using a lawyer for it. There are accountants that can do incorporation. My accountant, for example, could do incorporation, but I just felt like if my partner is a lawyer and is saying you should use a lawyer for this, I just feel like it made me feel more comfortable to go forward with that. And so I went and I did that. So that was the biggest chunk of this expense. And then from there, again, I had to pay my accountant kind of on a monthly basis. I also had to pay them like higher at one point for kind of like doing a backlog of it, because I didn't incorporate right at the beginning of 2024. I did it like, I want to say April or March, something like that. And so there was a little bit of backdating and things that had to be done. It was just like more complicated to do that setup. And then from there, I pay them that monthly amount for that whole remittance and everything like that. So yeah, it's pricey. It is pricey, but certainly, and I will talk about this, I guess, more in my financial learnings, I do feel like it's worth it for me and for my situation. This will be so individual to each person, but for me and everything that I have going on, I feel it's very worth it. But again, it's pretty pricey. And then travel. So on travel in 2024, I spent $4,432.86, which accounts for 24% of this pie. So after I went and said all that stuff about incorporation being expensive, I tend to spend more on travel. And in this case, I did not include travel for which my publisher reimbursed me. So I went to a book festival in Texas, and my publisher covered that whole thing. And so they reimbursed me for anything that I spent. And so in that case, I didn't include it in this because that wasn't money I spent. So I didn't include that. Also, my Canadian publisher, well, I was in a book festival, and the book festival covered airfare, and so I also didn't include that in this as well. So this is just like the stuff that I paid for. So I did some working trips to Toronto and to Hamilton, and I believe, oh, and then a writing retreat in New Orleans. We went to a writing retreat in New Orleans right in the beginning of the year, which was probably like the biggest expense, because anytime I go to the States, because of the conversion from Canadian to US, it's just like our dollar is very bad. And so all those things usually end up costing much more. So yeah, that is basically kind of the gist of all of those costs. And I mean, travel is expensive, especially like where I live, because I live quite a bit north. It's like the cost of things like flights or very long drives. And so it just tends to be a little bit pricier. So that's kind of the whole of that travel bit. Office expenses and hardware. I think on the chart I just put office expenses, but I think adding hardware helps. And so in 2024 on that, I spent $3,317.91, accounting for 18% of this pie. So this includes the cost of a new computer. So I got a new computer in 2024. I had previously been using my MacBook Air laptop for the longest time, and it was just like, it could not do the amount of things that I was doing on it, especially like with all of the kind of video processing. When I first bought that MacBook Air, I thought I was just going to be writing on it. I did not think I was going to be doing this whole YouTube business. And so it was just like, it was very different. I also didn't think I'd be making book trailers and all of that stuff for my books. I did not anticipate doing all of that. And so it was really like underpowered and it was really struggling. And so I made the investment in purchasing a Mac Mini just because I really already had like external keyboards and mouse and like monitor. And so I got a Mac Mini, I got another monitor, I got some speakers, and then I also did that whole revamp of my desk. So I got that kind of like riser for my desk, other things. This also includes things that I purchased for the kind of camera setup. And so all of that thing. Did I buy this new camera in 2024? I can't remember. So that might also be included in it, but it might not. I truly cannot remember if I bought it in 2024 or not. But yeah, so that's kind of all that is included in that. Also kind of general office expenses. So things usually like, what else do I buy? Like tape and like pens, Sharpies, which I also use for signing, that sort of thing, also falls into office expenses. And then finally, I had a book consult. So this was $163.02, accounting for 1% of this pie. And so this was, I had some translations done, some Mohawk translations, because in A Mastery of Monsters, there are some characters who are Mohawk, and I use some of the language in the book. And so I hired out some consultations, just to like make sure the spelling of everything was correct and that the translation was correct. And I also paid for audio recordings. So someone recording themselves saying the words. This is basically to help the audiobook narrator, because I wanted to make sure that I was getting correct pronunciations from the audiobook narrator and that sort of thing. And so that is basically what that was. That whole kind of consult section was just kind of getting that done, so that I can make sure that's all kind of settled and good for the book, because I want to make sure that I'm doing accurate representation. So that is what happened with that. And yeah, so that's all of the expenses, and that is for a total of $18,643. And so this is why I think this is why I was a little bit shy to like do exact figures the last time, because I'm aware that this is not nothing. This is a significant amount of money, but it's an investment in my business and it is reasonable for me. But it can be very different for you as an author, for your business, whatnot. And so yeah, again, that little disclaimer of you do not have to spend this. You do not. You absolutely do not. You can run an author business however it makes sense for you. These are just things that like made sense for me expenses wise, and so this is kind of what I spent. Yeah. And so the 2023 to 2024 comparison is what we have now of the expenses. So you can see their percentages, that sort of thing. And so the biggest difference for me was travel. So I did more travel in 2023 because my publisher sent me on tour. But what I will say I didn't think to do in 2023 is I included travel that my publisher had reimbursed me for. So I think this would be significantly less had I adjusted it the way I adjusted it for 2024. So I will keep that in mind. But I do feel like I did less travel in 2024. I think because I did so much travel in 2023 and I was like, budget wise, let's kind of curb this. Because I was kind of struggling a little bit towards the end there. And so I switched that around for 2024 to kind of like adjust the travel and have that be a little bit less just budget wise. And in 2024, the book consult section is larger because I was paying for sensitivity readers. And in that sort of the way that worked out is yeah, in 2023, I'd paid for sensitivity readers for a book I was working on in 2023 and 2024. But in 2024, I wasn't like in the timeline of paying for readers yet, but I will be paying for sensitivity readers in 2025. Basically the same readers, because they were reading for Mastery of Monsters, and that series has 3 books. And so I plan to use them for all 3 books. And so that'll be a cost that will come into the 2025, but wasn't in the 2024 just because of the way timing worked out. But yeah, so that's why that book consult section is bigger. And then advertising and promo in 2024 is, it's not as significantly different as I thought it would be, but it is more in 2024 because of that pre-order campaign, as I said. Let's get into these financial learnings for 2024. Again, not financial advice, not a financial expert, but these are kind of the things I learned. So let's talk about that tax fuck up. So essentially, I didn't realize. So the thing in Canada that I've now learned is that when you are earning as a self-employed person over a certain threshold, you have to prepay your taxes for the next year, which my accountant told me and I didn't understand. That was my bad. She's a good accountant. She told me. I just mixed up things in my head and I misunderstood. So yes, so you are supposed to pay for that tax year and also prepay quarterly for the next year. I thought that was something only US friends were doing. No, I also needed to pay quarterly. And so I did not realize this. So I got a bit of a penalty. I got a little bit of little wrist slap in terms of fee for this, which again is my own fault. And this is also the fault in that the Canada Revenue Agency was sending me emails to say that they had sent me a message, and I kept not logging in to check what the message was because for some reason I felt that this message would be irrelevant to me. I don't know why. But anyway, yeah, I should have been checking those. I should have been checking them every single time. So that was my fault. So anyway, it was fine because I always put aside money for taxes, and I usually overestimate how much I need to put aside for taxes. And so I already had a money set aside. And so all I needed to do was pull from that and just pay for it. So everything is good now. But yeah, I messed that up, which was like, so basically like back in like probably like 2022, I should have paid for 2 years at that point. But again, I didn't understand. And so yeah, it's a whole thing, but it's fine now. Everything is fine. Everything has been worked out. And so I'm up to date on all of that stuff. So that's good. And now that's something I understand. And so that's why that section was in fact what I had actually paid for taxes, because I was supposed to have paid before. Yeah, so that was a learning for sure. So there was that. Yeah, so yeah, I think that was like kind of the biggest learning. And then otherwise, I mean, I was very scared of doing the incorporation thing just because I knew the upfront costs would be large. And so that was a little bit scary. It was also a little bit scary to me that I would do all of this and then I don't know, that I would suddenly not be making enough money and it wouldn't be worth it. But I definitely think that it's very worth it. It's very worth it because now kind of like cataloged into the future, I know like from like 2024, I knew that I had enough for 2025 and even more so knowing that I have enough for 2026. So 2026 is kind of the year in which I need to sell a new book in order to kind of have continued income. And so it was good in that I realized, okay, I will by 2025, I will probably have enough for the whole of 2026. So I don't need to be panicking during 2026 about like selling something. Like I can sell something at the end of 2026 as long as I'm going to get paid in 2027. I can even sell something at the beginning of 2027 and still be like, okay. And so for me, that's really huge because basically at no point in my career prior to that have I felt that, because I've always been like, oh no, I have like too much here and too little here. And it was just like, this was just an ongoing problem for me. And the incorporation has solved that. And yes, the kind of like the startup costs are higher, and I mean I am paying monthly to kind of keep up with this, and I don't kind of know if I'm gonna have to do one more kind of big payment when it's like tax time. I might have to, and so it's a little bit of setup sticker shock, I suppose, but I feel like it will hopefully all be worth it in the end, and I kind of already feel like it's gonna be worth it. I'm not gonna really know for sure until tax time, like until I have done a year, like until I've done taxes for a year of being incorporated. I kind of won't really know how all of that is going to shake out, slash if it's going to feel worth it, but I feel like it probably will, so I'm good about that. I also feel really good about the investment in like a financial advisor and the accountant. Both together have made a really like positive impact on my sort of author career. It's definitely the sort of situation in which I wish that I had kind of set this up for myself right from the start, but I just like, I didn't know to do any of these things, and my family doesn't know about this stuff, and so it wasn't really something that I like had the education for, and so it's been a learning process. But for me personally, I feel like these things have really changed the game for me and have really helped me out a lot, and so yeah, I feel like I'm in a very good spot now. So those are kind of, I guess, the learnings, and I guess we'll just go right into, I guess we could have just so those are the learnings, and I guess we'll just flow right into final thoughts from here. Yeah, I feel like 2024 started off kind of stressful because I wasn't sure about that third book in the Master Your Monsters trilogy and whether that would be sold, and so that was kind of a little bit of like, I don't know if this is gonna happen, and so that created some like, I'm not sure what's gonna be going on, but from there on, and also the incorporation, that was also very stressful in like finding someone that could do it and like making sure they understand the needs as an author, and like getting that all sorted out was also kind of stressful. But once it was all set up, I feel like it was like pretty smooth sailing from there. I still do have times throughout the year where I'll suddenly panic and think like, I don't know if I have enough to live on in this year. And then I like think back to all my choices and like spending, and I'm like, nah. But yeah, everything was fine. Everything is fine. Everything worked out and everything is okay. So I feel like I have a lot more peace of mind. I think the incorporation especially has given me a lot more peace of mind because I no longer feel like I'm going to be scrambling. I feel like, okay, I've got everything kind of down pat for the next kind of 3 years, and I can feel secure about that. And I don't have to be in like this huge panic, or the next, like, I guess like 2 years now that we're in 2025, but when I was in 2024, it was like 3 years. And so I feel like that's been really helpful. And yeah, it's been good. It's given me a lot of like stability. And when the Couples Retreat, which is my adult thriller, when that didn't kind of immediately sell, it was kind of like, oh no, like that would have been like really helpful for my income, and that would have made me feel like much more secure. But in the end, I didn't need that to make me feel secure financially, because I felt like I was in a good spot. So yeah, that's basically all for this 2024 version of how I make money as a full-time author. If you have any questions for me, feel free to put them in the comments. Again, I can't really give financial advice. You should reach out to an accountant or a financial advisor, that sort of thing. And that's what I would recommend. But I can like answer just kind of general questions as much as I can. If it's something I can't answer, then I'll just say that I can't answer it. But just to kind of, yeah, give you as much knowledge as you can. I feel like this video is important. I mean, this is the sort of thing I would be curious about as an author, but I also feel like this is important in like giving a little bit more transparency about kind of like what it means to write full-time and be a full-time author in traditional publishing. I feel like this is a sort of thing where it's very easy to romanticize this, and part of me talking about this is like trying to give a realistic perspective of how this is and how this process can go, so that you can kind of understand, because I just feel like that's really important in like having an understanding of this whole thing. And I feel like so much of the publishing industry is very opaque. And if I can give at least a little bit of transparency, that's something that's important to me. And so, yeah, even though I'm not doing full transparency, I'm like, this is how much money I'm making because it makes me uncomfortable. I'm glad that I could at least give a little bit more in terms of the kind of author expenses. But anyway, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!